Okay, looks like I might be on the air. Um, because it was saying, let me check over here on the website. So it seems like it's changed a little bit. I'm going to refresh this, see if we are live. Okay, it looks like I am live here. Um, so let me just send a message over to, let's say, some of the people on Facebook. Sorry about that. I'm just checking to see um, how this has changed here since I last. Usually there's a button to click going live. Okay, now it's just loading here. Okay. Just checking here. Okay, let me just say. Okay. Okay, so yeah, just checking, also seeing some of the messages. So if you are joining, if you can say hi below the video here, you can leave a message here anonymously, or you can log in using this chat box that's below the video. Okay, so in today with this coaching call, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the vocabulary learning and building. So going into some of the messages that I had received here. And also checking over here, I see some comments on Facebook about the chat box not working. So if you can see this on a computer, that might work better. I have logged in on my phone, and there is a tiny little message area that I can, okay, this is through the computer. Okay. Oh, I see. There's a comment here about the chat disabled. Oh, it looks like you're using the YouTube chat. So I've actually enabled here the chat and go. But under the video, there should be a chat and go box. Okay. Or we can keep using here the Facebook messages. Okay. Still trying to figure out how to get this. I think next week I'll probably enable the the YouTube chat instead of this. Yeah, it's just sometimes with the YouTube chat that I need to open up the chat window there. Okay. Okay, yes, now I can see it. I had to change the browser. Okay. Okay, so I can see the message there on my phone as well. Okay, so so many tech options here to try to figure things out here. Okay. Okay, well, this seems to be working. Okay, yeah, so next week I'll try this thing. That's so for the vocabulary question and some questions that I've asked, at least in the Facebook group and some messages through private messages related to vocabulary learning. So one question, seeing this as a comment from Aneta about how to memorize vocabulary more efficiently in extending the active memory. Because, as she says here, her memory is leaking like a sieve. So that's kind of like a what you might use for like a pasta strainer, but the water's kind of leaking. So this is normal. The passive vocabulary is usually a lot larger than the active memory. Active memory meaning the words that you're able to retain and use when speaking and writing. So it is quite common to have a larger passive, things that you read and things that you listen to. That should probably not be news for most of us, but I do see a comment in here as well relating to Aneta using Anki instead of using like a text notebook. However, Aneta says that she has been using lists or decks. In Anki, they are decks of flashcards that are a very high amount. So she says she's been learning with about 100 items or tokens or expressions to be learning, and that this can be cumbersome and not as effective in order to use this for the activating the memory. So with my suggestion would be to focus on a smaller amount per day. I have been asking a few other people here what they have been used to, what has been feasible and manageable. I was also reading in here, let me see if I can find some of my notes here to share some of these studies, and I will bring this up as well. So I was recently looking at this PDF to do some research for today, and I will post this link here as well in the chat box here. So in this link, and I'll show this on my screen as well. Share this. So it looks like you should be able to see this on the screen. Now, the premise of this exercise, it was for taking, getting somebody to learn Arabic vocabulary words, and saying that the subject was an English speaker in her 40s and who also is involved in linguistics studies and wanting to expand her vocabulary. And the idea was, says here in this task, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here, to work on, for a period of 20 days, to increase a vocabulary of about 300 words. And they say that they were working on 30 minutes a day to expand the vocabulary and to test this periodically. And the first prediction was that maybe the amount of words might be too much at the time, but it was feasible to do this for about 25 words. There were tests, though, of these 300 words, and to see in terms of the recognition, these 286 words for that first test. There was some performance drop going down to about 219 words towards the end. And in terms of the recall test, this would be the active memory. Can they produce the words? This was also less. And in terms of vocabulary learning, it's not always expected that like you're going to get 300 words. If that's the target, there's going to be probably less than that amount achieved. So aiming for 100% retention, that's probably not feasible in this initial period. There needs to be lots of exposure. Also, 30 minutes is probably limited. Also, depending on the stimulus, learning these words in context, there are lots of things that go into the vocabulary learning process. So these are just some initial results of what can be done with like a 20-day process. And in terms of the conclusions, they were saying that in terms of like the effectiveness of the retention, this kind of went up and down. It wasn't completely going down. There were some ups and downs still in terms of retention, but it wasn't a complete drop off in terms of the number of days. They had expected that it might just go all the way sloping down, but it still kind of went up and down. The one conclusion was like maybe like the last day, day 20, there may have been less time available to review these vocabulary words, but it wasn't a complete drop off. They did say here in the conclusions that the 20-30 minute period and maybe focusing on 15 words a day is not that bad. It could be possible to expand this to 25 words a day, but aiming for this range of 15 to 25 would not be too overwhelming. And there were some suggestions here about expanding the length of time for this study. So maybe a 50-day period, and maybe expanding this to about 1,200 words, and seeing how those results would how this would work. And this is something that I would like to experiment as well with a few students to maybe put together a corpus here of about 1,000 words. I have also been going into the 1,000 most frequent words in English, and looking at how effective those word lists are in terms of how the fact that as you learn the top 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 words in the English language, that accounts for a significant amount of vocabulary in the language. So if you just focus on the top 1,000 words in English, you could get a reading comprehension or listening comprehension of upwards of 75%, 80% of what you're exposed to. So that would be a highly effective vocabulary. And I would like to experiment with this and see which words people know already today, like at the beginning of a program, and then gradually putting these words into context, putting them into short stories, designing flashcards that would have text, sample sentence, audio, and a picture, and then testing these to see for recognizing the words, and then also being able to produce the words and associate them with the sound, with the picture, with the text, and be able to turn this into a like a text, a vocabulary learning tool. So that's something that I would like to design and experiment with this for a few students who would want to test this out as it's being beta tested and produced. So this is one study in terms of how many words per day might be feasible. Obviously, this one is based on Arabic. Learning words in English, that might be that there might not be the difficulty of the alphabet, as the English is sharing the same letters with many other languages. I've struggled with learning Arabic, and the script that has been a first step in terms of the language, in addition to the pronunciation and recognizing these words. But just in terms of the amount of words per day and what could be expected from a 20-day period, and maybe what could happen over the course of a 50-day period. Obviously, as more and more and more words are learned, there also needs to be review sessions to keep the words active that were a week before or 2 weeks before, so that it's not just a drop off in retention, or that this does not feel as overwhelming in case there are days that are missed, or if the review sessions get harder and harder. So this is something I would like to experiment with students. In terms of figuring out what are those top 100 or 1,000 words, let me share with you this other, let me change the screen here and go to another document that I'd like to share with you. So with this one here, okay. And I will add this over here as well. And just to say, hey, hi, Carol. Thank you for joining. Let's see, join here. So, okay, this is another link I'd like to look at. I'm going to share this on my screen as well here in 1 second. Let me share this. Okay, so this is coming from the Corpus of Contemporary American English. This is one of the largest databases and collections of vocabulary. And recently, they've also been adding things for TV and movie scripts to account for even more of the spoken English. Here is what's called this is a free accessible list of the top 5,000 words in American English. And these are in terms of the frequency, and how they also talk about this dispersion of these words across multiple genres of spoken, academic, news, um, uh, fiction. So across multiple genres are those words that are um, worth learning. Um, and so this would be a list, and it says here you can download this, and these would be of these top 5,000 words. I would be interested in working on a program for like these top 1,000, and in a period of like a month and a half, like 45 days. And here you can also see this is through an alphabetical list. You can also see it in terms of part of speech, the most frequent verbs that would be on here. And also, like as you scroll down here, you can see this by other parts of speech. So, so this goes back to, yeah, adverbs and adjectives as well. So this is a very helpful list. These articles, the adverbs, and seeing these prepositions that would be most frequently used. So this is a good way, and the pronouns as well. So and the numbers. So this is a good place to start. Obviously, it is just a list of the words. It is lacking some of these details in terms of sentence examples. There is the corpus where you can search it and go through it. There's also a collocations list that goes along with this. There is a book that's related that goes with this, and this would include those top, most frequent collocations, nouns, adjectives that go with these words. And the idea that I would like to try to implement would be to focus on, let's say, these top 1,000 or so words from here. Let's say from about like here and to the top, and put them into these sentences, use these collocations. I would record the pronunciation here, also integrate this with a lessons related to pronunciation. So I have been working on teaching pronunciation, and looking at if I'm going to be teaching pronunciation, it would be also useful to also combine this with vocabulary words. So the most frequently used vocabulary words in the English language would be one way to combine both pronunciation and vocabulary learning. I've also seen that some students want to work on learning phrasal verbs or learning a few things on grammar. So it is possible to combine all three, depending on the quality of these, the variety of these sentences, these example sentences, and the pictures, the audio, and also putting this together with maybe a vocabulary learning tool, like a web app. So I am looking for potential students who would be interested in testing this out as well. But the idea would be these would be the most frequently used words in the language, and if you can learn these ones, these would be accounting for the comprehension would go up significantly. Let me see here. In a similar thing with the Wikipedia with the word lists. So here as well in the Wikipedia, you can see they from these frequently lists of related to TV. In these top 1,000 words are accounting in terms of at least TV and movie This is accounting for about 85% of the words. So if there's a 29 million database corpus of these scripts, these top 1,000 words represent 85% of that. So of those 29 million, 24 of those words that are repeated again and again are among this top 1,000 words. So that would account for a very highly effective core vocabulary to know, and realize that just going from this list of 1,000 and then adding another 9,000 words to that list, this gets just another 12%. I was looking at another book called English Vocabulary in Use, and it was saying that, if I can find this as well, just give me 1 second here. It was saying that the top 45% of English words would come from 50 words. So it's incredible how the most frequent words from from 1 to 100 are heavily used again and again and again. So if you look at this list over here from these top 50, you will see these words again and again and again throughout spoken and written English. So these words would be very important to focus on first, and be familiar with their pronunciation as well, how they might change, because that's also what would make TV and movies perhaps a little difficult, is recognizing what could be alternative pronunciation for these very frequent words that are being used. Okay, now let me also go and share another document here that I wanted to go through with the also, as you're looking at the screen with the YouTube video, you can change the quality button, because right now, at least for me, it says auto. If you raise this to 720p, that will make the image sharper as you're looking at this. So, I also would like to share part of this research done on the vocabulary learning theories. I'm going to put this over here as well. And let me open that and then share this on my screen. Okay, let me go over here as well. So this is another research document related to the vocabulary learning strategies. And a few things involved in here are saying that in terms of these skills and techniques, this list of strategies, this one they're referring to goes back to 1984. That's a little bit older now, but it's still more recent compared to, let's say, say in the 1950s, which was heavily based on just teaching the language through a grammar and translation approach, and just making it systematic as if it were like teaching math. Now, in terms of acquiring kind of vocabulary through reading, also looking at the words in context, trying to guess the words based on how they're being used, also trying to understand the grammatical function, looking at those other tools or other surrounding words in the context, and then in terms of looking up the words, knowing how to effectively use a dictionary, or knowing how to use online tools when you're looking to use this word in terms of its register, how frequent it is, and how does it compare to other words. So those are some other things that I would like to teach in terms of what is an effective way to be learning these vocabulary words. So if you're going to be looking them up, what tools are you using to look them up, and how do you assess if you're getting as much information as possible for, let's say, your notebooks or things that you can use to practice this vocabulary online, and to also see how you are learning compared to other learners. So these are a few things that I would like to put into practice, especially for English learners, as I have much more experience on that point. So these are a few things of these traditional methods, and seeing how many of these words, let's say, do students know to begin with, and then using these techniques to expand them, and then do this over a period of over, let's say, a month or a month and a half. Okay. So there's several of these vocabulary learning research documents that are out there, and evidence to support which ones are helpful, which ones are more effective. And I have seen, going back into let me just go over here back to the Facebook. There was some reference to the gold list method that David James recommends. And if you're not familiar with the gold list method, the idea is from there, you're writing down words in a notebook, and you're trying not necessarily to force yourself to learn those words, because there's a little bit of a comparison to something of like Newton's law of physics, in terms of if you push something, there might be some pushback. So if the harder you try to memorize a word, it might stay in that short-term memory, but in terms of pushing this word into the longer-term memory, a less aggressive method might be helping to see if those words stay in that long-term memory. So the technique with the gold list method is that you're kind of writing down words, probably about like 25 of them, and then checking after a period of time, how many words do you happen to still remember and that you can produce? And then that's part of what would be kind of like a distillation process, where you're seeing if it's still there in your memory, but not necessarily trying to push on this too hard. It's one method. I haven't tried it myself, but I do know that a couple participants in Speaking Challenge have also tried this out. So it would be good to get their perspective, get their insights on how effective it is. There's also another comment about from Maria related to Anthony Metivier and the Memory Palace. And so Anthony, his website, the Magnetic Memory Method, I haven't yet tried it myself, but I do know that a lot of what he is recommending, these memory palaces, it's usually associating some kind of a I want to say like a blueprint for like a home or a place or design, and then associating words as you're kind of walking through, mentally walking through that location. And he says that any of these places that you've been to can work as a memory palace, just as long as you're not potentially going in circles. So you need to have some kind of a layout where you could go from a start to a finish, and then you're linking the vocabulary with some kind of a visual cue. And I think he's also saying something that is just very exaggerated, so that this memory, you'll have a lot of like shape to it. It occupies a very, very vivid. If things are very boring, it's more likely that you will forget this information. So being able to create like a dragon with the nose, and just all this kind of stuff that would help you imagine the vocabulary that you're trying to retain. So something that's just maybe ridiculous or ludicrous that just gets your memory to associate it. Mnemonics are also something that can help with the sound of something, or if it is associated with something else that you would recognize. That's another technique that can help. I know with the website Memrise, they do a lot of using mnemonics and using memes, the images, and also using images that might evoke like a joke that can help you remember something. So the more creative you can get, the easier that will become for remembering this vocabulary word, or how it sounds or how it's used. So you want to try to get as many of your senses involved. I've even seen some experiments done with smell or even taste. This has been something that's interesting a couple times, where if for some reason, let's say I went on vacation and there was like a shampoo or a bar of soap that I used at a hotel, and I had this sample that I kept with me when I came back to my home after the vacation. Sometimes if I can just smell that that shampoo or that bar of soap, this can take me back to that vacation. I can relive a little bit in my mind, where was I, or what was I doing, or when was this. Music, sound is also a way to help the memory. Obviously, people remember certain times of their life associated with a certain song. So you can take certain a sound, you can take a smell. There's even certain food. There's food that like a snack that I remember that I purchased when I was living in France. These little cookies, and I used to buy that when I was studying. And now, if I eat that food again as a snack, it takes me back to when I was a student in my 20s, and kind of remembering the dormitory, remembering the room, and visualizing myself being in that room and how I decorated it. So just a food, a taste, can take me back. There's another set of cookies or snacks that I bought at a corner shop when I was working at an office. So as a snack, that was something I ate on a regular basis, but it was something that I had only been eating when I was at that office. So that particular snack, it is isolated in my memory for that experience. So that ends up being like associated with that experience. Sometimes there are like a specific playlist that I can put on my phone, and not just using it in a random order. If I have that playlist in a certain order and it goes through it, I can later kind of remember my commute to a place. So when I hear that song in that order, in that sequence, I can think of, oh yeah, I was at this street corner, or I was like in the metro, I was just passing by this stop. So you can definitely build into your vocabulary learning process ways to associate a certain food, maybe a new food that you haven't eaten before. You can start to associate that food with this vocabulary learning process, or certain smells. Um, so this is something I haven't quite experimented with it directly, but I've been interested in seeing out, like, would it be possible to associate a certain smell with verbs, or a certain smell with adjectives, or a certain smell with nouns, and seeing if there's ways to trigger your memory based on smell. But definitely get your senses involved in your memory. Create something that's just not only visual, color, shape, maybe something you can hold using your hands, but something that can also trigger your audio, the oral sound and that memory. But the smell and the taste are definitely very powerful memory tools as well. So if you can learn vocabulary words in a context and also create some kind of a stimulating experience that accompanies the words, that they're not just isolated 3 or 4 letters on a black and white piece of paper, but they have a life, they have a shape, you can see them, you can hear them, you can smell them. Try to involve as many of your senses as possible. So these are some things that I would like to research with a handful of students, maybe in a process that could be for like a month and a half, focusing on some things on pronunciation, some things on these core like 1,000 top frequent words that would be in the language. So and let me see here if there are some questions or comments about what I have discussed here, or if you relate to any of this as well with your own vocabulary learning. I'll be happy to take some questions here. I see a few people able to watch. Let me know if you have questions. Just trying to keep an eye on the text here. And one of these other links here, one of these books that I've used before. I've seen the intermediate one, and I'd also like to see for the just sharing a few of the recommendations here. So this book, this English Vocabulary in Use, you can find this book on Amazon by Michael McCarthy, and a few of these pages, a few of the recommendations about learning vocabulary, general advice in these aids are tools that you're using for the learning. I think these are very useful to share. So just want to briefly mention this, but one of these things here was about this, that I mentioned here, about the statistic here, about this, how many words make up 45% of everything written in English, and this answer, 50 words. These top 50 words in English make up about 45% of what's written, and that would be going back to, like, I don't know, the word the and of. So knowing some of those core words can definitely increase some of the basic, like structural, functional comprehension of what you're reading. They say here that the average native speaker is using about 5,000 words in their daily speech. And apparently Churchill had a vocabulary in terms of what was analyzed in his writing of about 60,000 words. And they're saying that at least 500,000 in the English language here. But in terms of what you need to know or what most adults are using, it's about 5,000. So, I mean, if you can get about 1,000 words, you're heavily going to increase your level of comprehension. And there's some ways of writing down the words and phrases, not just isolated, but what words go along with them, what words are associated with them. Those are called collocations. This is usually very helpful to see for, because words are not just in isolation. Words exist in a context. So as many of those little details that you can, this will help increase how natural the words you're using sound. And this is also in other languages as well. You want to learn those words that are frequently used together. And then you can certainly learn the words through reading and listening. It's just probably not such a good idea to look up every single word that, excuse me, every single word that you don't know. You want to try to guess and see if you're able to guess words from the context or how they're being used in a sentence. Since even if you do look up a word in a dictionary, you need to know the context to know how it's being used, which type, which context is this. There was a game that I used to do with listening to the radio when I was in France, and I would go through the radio, listen for like 2-3 seconds, and try to guess the context based on some of the words that I was listening to see if I could, like if he's running and he's going, and like, okay, that's sports. And then the prime minister told the senator that, like, oh, that's politics. So you try, and if you buy now, we'll send you another. Like, okay, that's they're trying to sell something, or that's an advertisement. So just based on a few seconds of content, you can start to create a context in your head and try to associate associating these words that would come up there. Let me take a look at some of these comments here from Carol. So I know, yeah, I said, did you touch on the statistic that gives the average number of times one must encounter a word in order to learn it? That's a good question. I hadn't looked into that detail. I would like to know that. In my own experience from like French and Spanish, I would say that whenever I've experienced or discovered a new word that I don't know, and I would say my exposure is 1 at that moment. That's the first time I've seen that word. My general reaction is don't pay attention to that word. If that's the first time I've seen that word and I've never seen it before, I'm first a bit cynical, and I'm first a bit kind of it's probably not worth my effort. But it'll go on a list, like a mental list of words that I've seen once in my life. Now, if they end up just on that list of words that I've only seen once in my life, they're probably not worth learning. Then and I'll try to pay attention to like, where was I or what was I doing when I saw that word that once in my lifetime? Like, was that something in a news article? Was it something on the news? Was it a movie? Just to have a mental note of it. but it still is just on that list of words I've only seen once in my life. Now, however, if it goes on to like I've read it or seen it or heard it twice, now it's moved on to another list, which would be, okay, words I've seen at least twice in my life. And then as that filter goes to words I've heard or read or from like 3 or 4 times, then I start to prioritize paying attention to it. And once it goes from that frequency of like, okay, just once in my life to, okay, I've heard this about 3 or 4 or 5 times. Maybe it's worth my attention now. So I might try to associate those different contexts they've read or heard, or who said this, or was this somebody older than me? What kind of context with this? So those details would help me try to guess the meaning if possible. And then if I'm really stuck, I go into the dictionary and double check this. And then it's really important to try to use that word in my speaking or writing to test it. Because if I don't test it in terms of reading, or sorry, in terms of writing or speaking, it's just going to remain in my passive vocabulary. And I also want to get a little bit of a reaction from a native speaker to see, did I use that correctly? And if I wasn't using it correctly, what's some more extra detail that I need to be aware of to be able to use it? And I'll keep testing it until it kind of passes a native speaker without raising an eyebrow. So if I'm using it and it works and people understood me and they're not correcting me, I might be getting closer to using that actively and correctly. But I want to test it as much as I can, and not be afraid to test it, and not be afraid to get that feedback on, is there something I'm missing that the dictionary didn't mention? So that's a little bit my own practical theory in terms of like, and I've seen this also through teaching English, and especially when there's journalism and articles involved, where students will get stressed out when they see a fancy word that they've never seen before, and I have to remind them, I'm a native speaker. That's the first time I've seen that word, and I'm in my 20s or I'm in my 30s. There's a chance that you probably don't need to learn that word because it's not very frequent. So combining these frequency lists is a way to know which words to prioritize. Okay, but I will look a little bit more into how many words do we need for that retention. I think, let me know. Actually, I think I do have some research here that could be helpful. Let me stop sharing here and see if I can find that for a second. The Pimsleur, with his research, Dr. Paul Pimsleur, just one second. Okay, yes. Let me see if I can share this over here. Wait, no. I had accessed this before. Just one second here. Sorry. Just one second. Okay, I think I found this here. Yeah, so go over here. So here is the original research that Paul Pimsleur had put together. So let me see if I can share this on my screen. Okay. So part of the Pimsleur research, and also in terms of some of the basis for spaced time repetition software, for example, Memorize and Anki and several of those apps that you use on a regular basis, they're based on this, some of it is based on this research about this memory exposure. So yes, this does relate to this question of how many times should you be exposed. So the way I explain this to a lot of students is this first situation where you hear that one word and how long is it going to stay in your memory, it's going to drop very quickly within a few seconds. So the relationship to this example would be, you meet somebody for the first time at a cocktail party and they say, hey, nice to meet you, my name is blah, blah, blah. If you don't use that word within the next 10 to 20 seconds, you might forget that person's name. So if you start to use that word, that person's name a couple times, like, oh, it's nice to meet you, Michael. Tell me, Michael, where are you from? Oh, that's very interesting, Michael. Like, once you started to use this person's name a couple times within that conversation, your memory is going to get a boost here. So he had noticed that if you got a boost to your memory with this graph of number 3, within a few seconds, this downward trend of losing that word within 20 seconds now gets a little bit more extended. It's going to go for a little bit longer time. And over here, you can see some of the research of it's a bit exponential. So you need a boost within about 25 seconds, which is 5 squared. And then after that, 5 cubed. So now about 2 minutes in. And then 5 to the 4th, getting about 10 minutes in. So this will help expand this this vocabulary use longer and longer as the more exposure you get to it. So that's in terms of the retention part and why we want this like spaced time repetition. So at those certain points, you'll be asked to recall this. And so those Pimsleur tapes, or these 30-minute programs, they are combining these this research to help you with that. So overall here, you've got this, these half a minute, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, and then it keeps going on to like the 10th time that you're recalling this memory or this word, you're probably doing this about like 4 months later, and this is going to keep you remembering that word for probably about a year in terms of this research. I've also shared this document, this research, with students who work in advertising, and they told me that they had 3 sets of advertising campaigns. And the first type was awareness. So if there's a new product or a new service, they need to create awareness, and that creates a huge amount of exposure. So I've noticed this where there might be advertising on a bus shelter, on a billboard, on a rolling kind of kiosk. So you will see that same ad or variations on an ad in different shapes and sizes, but in many different places. So that you want to create that exposure as much as possible. In terms of language learning, I create this exposure by taking, let's say, if I'm looking at like level beginner material, I will take several books at that level, at the beginner level, and I'll try to find like podcasts and videos and reading books and things So I want to create this sense of exposure to a core vocabulary list and say, oh, I've heard that word before, I've seen that word before, and just bombard myself with these words that would be used on a frequent basis, and just get that sensory input to a high amount of words, a high amount of exposure. Then they've also mentioned that there's another type of, like in terms of the advertising, another type of campaign, which would be this kind of maintenance campaign, where they want to keep the brand or the product or the service active in the top of mind of the consumer. So that kind of a boost for the memory is not as intensive as an awareness campaign, but that it still needs to exist to keep that memory fresh and active. So when you can apply these advertising campaigns to this exposure in terms of its intensity, and in terms of like how intensive do you need to work on being exposed to this vocabulary, and then a refresher might not need to be as intense. So I do like the pencil method as well, but my one kind of down point is that you have to go through those like 30-minute sessions completely. They don't quite have like a 5-minute reduced refresher. So that's something that I would like to create for students as well, of like, here's a 30-minute program to help you like gain awareness to these vocabulary words. But once those have now, like the exposure is then set in multiple times, then you might just need like a refresher, something not as intensive, but maybe just a little bit more subtle and in a shorter amount of time. So you don't have to go through the entire 30 minutes or entire hour for that process. But let me go back to just a few other comments and questions here. So do you think the number of words needed is similar for being able to effectively communicate in other languages? Yeah, I do think that across the Romance languages, there are like a core 1,000 or a core 2,000 words. Also, if you're exposed to multiple Romance languages like Spanish and French, you obviously get a shared amount of cognates between English, Spanish, and French. That definitely gave me a boost to my French after I had studied Spanish, and I relied a little bit on some of those words like important, importante, important, and tried to expand my not exactly expand my vocabulary, but try to focus on kind of a let's say like a carry-on suitcase worth of vocabulary words. Maybe I don't need to get all of the words in the dictionary, but what would be the essential ones that I could use to express myself in both languages, so I didn't have to constantly be learning a different word here, a different word there. I felt a little bit lazy, I guess, to try to focus on the shared vocabulary that was in common. And guessing the words from context, I do that all the time, but I'm wondering how guessing like that helps one remember or add the word. Guessing, I think, is a bit more on the comprehension side, the reading and the listening part. And it is important in the conversational skills to practice the guessing and trying to use the word actively to see if what you had understood was correct. Because if you're just nodding your head and going, you may not have understood this word, how it's being used. Or one thing that I've noticed from a lot of the pronunciation association is that the brain is sometimes a little bit lazy in terms of, if it hears a new word, it's going to try to associate it with a word that you already know. So what I mean by that is, I can't think of the example with my daughter, but like if I'm using adult adult big words with my kids, they might raise their eyebrow and go like, "What?" And they're trying to associate that new word with a word they do know. Oh, you said this. Oh, you must mean this. And I'm like, no, this is a new vocabulary word for you. And I've noticed this where sometimes there's a tendency to not want to learn a new vocabulary word. It's try to like that new word that I'm not familiar with, maybe it was mispronounced as a word that I do know. So the brain seems to have a tendency to want to focus on what it already knows and not necessarily expand on it. Obviously, kids are always expanding their vocabulary on a daily basis, but I've just noticed in my own language use and also working with my kids that sometimes there's this like there's kind of like an error message saying like new word, oh, it must be an old word that I'm already familiar with, and then you have to kind of like a double click confirm of like, no, this is a new word, learn it, expand your vocabulary. But it's a tendency like, is that a new word or is that I just heard something? So that's a little bit on the guessing of double checking that somebody understood something correctly. And yeah, 50 times ability, at least what I've read. But yeah, getting as much exposure as you need really bombards you, and looking at this from different perspectives. If it's like reading and listening, writing, active, try to create as much of a stimulation as possible to, because I think of like a word just like on a map. It's just like a tiny little point. It doesn't have any shape or volume. It's going to disappear. But once you start adding all of these exposures, it's like a snapshot of that word, and you start to get an idea of how it feels, what it looks like, what it sounds like, how it's being used, who's using it, which context, which genres. So the more detail you add to that word, that creates its context. And that's usually where you can kind of extract that memory when you're trying to speak or write, or activate it when you're reading and listening. Okay. And yeah, the idea of like a 5-minute refresher sounds very useful. And yeah, using pencil a lot. It doesn't hit the words very often. It does go back occasionally, but I think it's not really enough. Yeah. One thing I've noticed with a couple of in terms of premise or method, they usually don't want to give you the transcript. However, there are some enthusiastic language learners who've like gone through and written down some of those transcripts. And one thing that I tried doing when I had access to, let's say, like an MP3, or could take the audio and then for my own use, take the conversation that was being analyzed. So some of those conversations might be like 30 seconds or 1 minute. So I might not want the entire 30 minutes for that 1 minute of the conversation. I might just want that 1 minute conversation just to activate the vocabulary. However, the rest of that 30 minutes, it might be taking variations on some of the questions, and you could maybe turn that into a list of some of the questions of, can you take it from, do you understand, to, I mean, did you understand, or I don't understand. Do you understand him? Do you understand her? One method that is pretty good at those kinds of drills is the Foreign Service Institute language guides. Those things were written in like the 1950s and things. They're still based on that like methodology of drill, drill, drill. I do kind of like that old school approach sometimes, where trying to add some variations on take this question and what adjectives could you add in there, or what verbs could you use to replace, or what objects could you add to this to expand on creating the making an automatic reflex of using this phrase. So if it's like French and getting into it, est-ce que tu, est-ce que tu, est-ce que tu, est-ce que tu, like getting that core little part of a phrase automatic, and then adding the vocabulary words on there, like est-ce que tu aimes, est-ce que tu parles, est-ce que tu veux, so bridging this into the vocabulary words that you want to use, and try to get that to roll off your tongue as fast as possible. So there's much more I could probably share on here about vocabulary learning, but I would like to have a couple slides to go back with this. But, so thank you here for watching and going through some of these links. And as I mentioned, I would like to put together a program, like a 30-day, 45-day program to experiment with some of this, especially for English learners, and to see how effective this is, how much the retention is, and how much the recordings might be improved, or the pronunciation might be improved as well. So if you are interested in this concept, please leave a message or send me a reply. So getting a couple people to beta test this would be really cool, and finding some motivated learners who want to expand the vocabulary and also the pronunciation and work on their speaking skills with this. Okay, and if that program, if that concept works, obviously it could be expanded to other languages. But I just need to get the ball rolling on a test group and a test period. Okay, well, I need to wrap up here, but if you want to join, I'm going to be going over on Instagram with Natalie of Fun and Functional English. I'll just put her tag on here. So I will be over here in a few minutes, about 15 minutes from now. Let me just put this link. Yeah, so I will be over here in about 15 minutes from now to talk. And the topic that will be over there is about like fear and phobia. But, okay. Well, thank you very much for joining for today. I hope you have found this useful for discussion about like the vocabulary learning, and hopefully you found these kind of sessions useful. And hope to see you, talk to you next week. And take care. Bye for now.